So we've got it posted on we've got H274 posted on our webpage if you want to just look at your own screen, and we've got it up now on the big screen. So good morning, Beth.
Good morning. Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. We're doing a walkthrough of H274, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So we're going to scroll all the way down. So this is entitled An Act Relating to Agriculture and Nutrition Education. And the substance of the bill begins on page 2. And section 1 is adding a new statute to Title 16, which is the education title. And the statute would be titled Agriculture and Nutrition Education Curriculum. Subsection A requires the Agency of Education in conjunction with the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets to develop an agriculture and nutrition curriculum for elementary and secondary schools. The curriculum shall include teaching about the cultivation of food, farming practices, and nutritional benefits. On line 9, subsection B requires the State Board of Education to ensure that agriculture and nutrition education is included in its education quality standards. And subsection C in section 1 is requiring each supervisory union to ensure that agriculture and nutrition education is included in its union-wide curriculum. On line 14, page 2, section 2 is amending section 906 in Title 16, which is the course of study. So this is our minimum course of study. It's the kind of foundation from which all curriculum and educational requirements in the state are built from. And you'll see it includes things like basic communication skills, reading and writing, citizenship history, physical education, literature, etc. And then on page 3, line 7, subdivision 5 is amended to read the natural sciences, including agriculture and nutrition education. And then the bill would have an effective date of July 1, 2023. That is it.
Pretty short. So there seems to be 3 different things maybe going on here. Are they all necessary, or are some of them just sort of supportive?
If you decide to work on this bill, I think we may want to tweak some of who's doing what here, but yes. So in Vermont, and you are the legislature, right? So you can do whatever you want. But generally speaking, curriculum is a local level function and responsibility. So in law, each supervisory union is required to have a union-wide curriculum. So if it's one's like Burlington, right? One school district, one town, one supervisory district, the curriculum's the same there. But even supervisory unions with multiple school districts under them are required to have a union-wide curriculum. That curriculum needs to meet standards adopted by the state board. They need to, the curriculum needs to include subjects and instruction in order to ensure that the students in that district are meeting the state Board of Education standards. So the State Board of Education is charged with adopting education standards for the state. It's a very broad delegation, and that's really it. And
the delegation to the board.
Yes. What adopting standards means is that's it. It's not like that concept is not necessarily fleshed out. So I'll read right from the state board's duties here. So the state board in 16 VSA 164 is charged with Implementing and continually updating standards for student performance in appropriate content areas and at appropriate intervals in the continuum from kindergarten to grade 12, and methods of assessment to determine attainment of the standards of student performance. The standards shall be rigorous, challenging, and designed to prepare students to participate in and contribute to the democratic process and to compete in the global marketplace. The standards shall include a standard for reading level proficiency for students completing grade 3. So that's it. It doesn't dictate what content areas the standards are required to be in, or more specific parameters other than they need to be rigorous, challenging, and designed to prepare students, et cetera. So the minimum, and then there's the minimum course of study, which lists, this is kind of like the basic foundational subjects that everything needs to be built upon, including, so our independent schools have to meet minimum course of study, and home study programs have to be meeting minimum course of study. And that's basic communication skills, citizenship history, physical education, literature, natural sciences, and fine arts. And then expanding upon that, the state board would be developing standards that students have to meet across the state for in public schools. And then each supervisory union is responsible for the nitty gritty, the curriculum. How is that information being taught in order to help ensure that the students are meeting those standards?
Beth, are you able to make that bigger? Thank you. Representative Lipsky.
Beth, thank you. It's really fascinating. Including agriculture and nutrition education, semicolon, is that what we are adding to
Yes.
in already existing?
Yes. The only thing that you're adding is the underlined language. So for minimum course of study, and if you choose to work on this bill and move it along, my guess is you will get feedback if you invite it from the agency and the state board on kind of and supervisor unions on kind of everyone's role and what they think everyone should be doing. So there are, I believe, lots of courses taught in Vermont schools that aren't specifically called out in this minimum course of study, right? And even if you were to go to the Agency of Education's website and look at all of the content areas that the state board has adopted standards in, it's a little bit broader or more narrow, depending on let's see. So the use of numbers, right? Math. But the State Board of Education has, specific standards in relation to math that's, far more expansive than just the use of numbers. So it's possible that one avenue to approach this topic is you don't need to amend the minimum course of study because agriculture and nutrition education might fit in naturally with another state standard or content area. But this would be one way to ensure that agriculture and nutrition education is always included, and that would be across the board for independent schools and home study programs as well.
And is this list here that we're looking at, section 2 in the course of study, this list that's in existing statute, is it directing the board to somehow incorporate into its standards or to consider what's in this list when it's developing its standards?
Yes.
So directing somebody else.
So the portion of the statute that's not here, right, or the asterisks, right, we start with subsection B. So there is a subsection A, and it reads, in public schools, approved and recognized independent schools and in-home study programs, learning experiences shall be provided for students in the minimum course of study, period. And then the state board is tasked with developing the standards with which students need to meet, working within the minimum course of study.
Okay,
Like I like to think of the minimum course of study as kind of the foundation from which everything is built. And if we were to go to the Agency of Education's website, they have a section on content areas and the standards that the State Board of Education has adopted for those content areas is all laid out. There's also the education quality standards, which is also a requirement of the state board to develop education quality standards.
a requirement of the state, sorry to
The
keep it.
state board develops the education quality standards.
They've been charged by the legislature to do that.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And those are just for public schools, unless there is a process for an independent school to meet education quality standards. I think there may only be one school that does that right now. But education quality standards are, it's more than just course content. It's things about staffing, continuing education for staff, leadership, access to technology. The education quality standards is, the way it's framed in statute is, they're just called educational quality standards, but it's not just curriculum content. It's broad for the public schools, how the public schools are managed, from a quality perspective.
Representative Lipsky.
So, and I know there are other folks here who've served on school boards, so I've spent over 10 years on it. And all of those qualifications to teach a subject and the training and the continual professional development, this is a whole new category where possibly, people can talk about drugs, alcohol, and tobacco, but they've been trained in their education how to deliver that. This would be a whole new area of requirement. Some of us are true believers that nutrition and fresh and local, they all go hand in hand almost as common sense. But if you're not pre-trained or qualified, does that put this whole sort of scope of the proposed bill at risk at this point? In your legal
I'm not going to give you a satisfying answer. I'm sorry. It really depends. So the teachers, public school teachers are licensed under by the Professional Standards Board, and they have there's kind of like the base licensure level, and then there's endorsements for various subject matter expertise. And like I said, it's possible that agriculture and nutrition education already fits in one of those endorsement areas, right? Maybe it's not specifically spelled out, but it's possible that there is a concentration already that might naturally include or might naturally be a bridge to agriculture and nutrition education. I don't know that. That would be a question for the field, but it's an excellent point that if you're going to require it, we also have other standards that require, licensing, and they have their own standards for teaching and subject matters. So yes, you would want to make sure that all fits together.
Would it be, just before we go to Mike, is there statute that addresses those standards, and would it be?
For teacher licensing?
Yeah, I wonder if we should be including anything in this bill that would be necessary to, address that issue.
Yep. I would have to look at, and if it's okay with you, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute.
Yeah, and let's just flag it.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
I believe it's a broad delegation to the Professional Standards Board to develop those areas. So I'll have to look at that.
Representative Rice.
Yeah, well, I guess first just to Representative Lipsky's point is we know that a lot of this is already happening in some schools, right? Like some schools have robust sort of programs that are based around school gardens or greenhouses, and so it might be interesting just to sort of hear generally if the teachers who are doing that have one of the specific already existing endorsements, and if there's already sort of something set up and it's just not. And then the question I had for you is, so one thing that we talked about when we sort of walked through this bill the first time was that a lot of the sort of engendering the belief in the importance of knowing where your food comes from can actually be spread across other disciplines, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if including it specifically in the natural sciences sort of would be restrictive to sort of saying, oh, that farming and nutrition piece has to be in the science, wing, as opposed to sort of creatively incorporate into the curriculum across disciplines.
So the way I view minimum course of study, and I caveat all of this by saying, I can interpret for you what the black letter of the law means on the page, right? But the field may be doing something slightly different, and they may have been doing it slightly different for decades, right? So I would always encourage you, if it's of interest to you and it fits within your agenda, to hear from the field and how they interpret something or carry out the law. But the way I view minimum course of study is not that, I think it's an interesting question. I don't think that by including it here in the natural sciences, it would limit this subject matter to only being taught in science classes. But I would encourage you to hear from the field on that. I think there are other ways to get at this, requiring this topic in public schools, other than being as prescriptive as I've drafted this bill. You could just require that each supervisory union ensures that this is a part of the union-wide curriculum, and then ask the state board to ensure that the education quality standards includes that. And then the state board is going to be kind of plugging, using their expertise, and the education quality standards are a rule, so it would need to go through rulemaking that includes public input. They could kind of plug in this topic in, where they feel it fits in all of their other content areas. So I don't think by adding it to the minimum course of study, it's limiting the courses the subject matter could be taught in. It's possible that you hear something different from the field, but that's not the way I read this. I read this as this is the foundation upon which you've got to build everything. And then each supervisory union is going to have its own curriculum. And the curriculum is how it's taught. What are the books used? What are the courses offered? What are the teaching methods employed? Is it a lecture or a garden, right? It could vary, but adding this requirement to the minimum course of study is a way to get at requiring this across all of our educational platforms.
So on education quality standards, is there parallel language that applies to approved independent schools and homeschoolers, or it's quiet on that?
Education, so the education quality standards are currently open and undergoing potential revisions right now. The state board has a active subgroup that are working on them, in large part in relation to the work that the Act One working group is doing. So on equity, inclusion, and diversity. And the education quality standards apply only to public schools right now. There is a process for an approved independent school to also follow education quality standards. They have to meet certain criteria, and it's a voluntary process. And then they would be recognized as meeting education quality standards. I believe there's only one approved independent school in the state that's doing that right now. That's not to say that there aren't other independent schools that are meeting almost all of those education quality standards. And the education quality standards are not just courses and what we think of as curriculum. It's a lot more about governance and staffing, which is potentially very different between public schools and independent schools. To further complicate matters, there's also new standards being developed. I think it came out of Act 127, which was the pupil weighting bill last year, on more district-wide business practices and looking at those from a quality assurance perspective. There's nothing really in state law that kind of drives that right now. So those standards are also being developed right now. And it's unclear to me just how they're going to fit together in the end. But to go back to the substance of your question, no, there's nothing specific. In order to be in an independent school, either approved or recognized, you have to meet a minimum course of study. Full stop.
Representative Cole.
What is the process like when something new is incorporated like this for informing educators that this has happened?
That's a great question, and I think that would be a question for the field, not me.
Do you know how recently this section has been amended?
I'm gonna look that up for you. So we're in section 906. I do know that comprehensive health education was not always, that's a relatively recent, and I'll tell you what that means once I find those dates. Let's see. Oh, it's been a while. 1990.
Third of the century.
So the list that of six, not items, areas, has been, looked like this for a third of a century.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And I don't think you need to, in order to require at least public schools, actually, in order to require any school, I don't think you absolutely have to update the minimum course of study. It's a way to ensure that public schools, independent schools, and home study programs, full stop, have to include something about agriculture and nutrition in their programs. You could certainly use different language to require that, other than updating the minimum course of study. If you were just interested in public schools, again, you could just require that each supervisory union include the subject matter in their curriculum. You have the power to do that. And then you could ask the state board to adopt content area standards for that subject matter, without amending the minimum course of study.
Can you help us understand then in section 1, when we're asking here in part C, that each supervisory union shall ensure, would this provision be one of many similar provisions that direct supervisory unions to include something in their curriculum, as opposed to having the board set standards?
Yeah, so if it's in, if you ask the state board to develop, to adopt a standard in this content area, or to update its education quality standards to include agriculture and nutrition education, then it's automatic that the supervisory unions are going to have to include that in their curriculum. So you wouldn't necessarily have to call that out. I'm just looking quickly through this section that has the course. You know, there really aren't a lot, there really aren't any. There's tobacco use and alcohol and drug use prevention education curriculum that was added originally in 1983, but most recently amended in 2014. That was added to this chapter in Title 16 that falls under course of study. There are often many drafting requests each year to add different things to requirements to public schools as far as topics, civics education, financial literacy, et cetera. And this is one format that has been used, kind of this boom, boom, boom. But by no means do I think this is the only way to get at requiring nutrition and agricultural education in at least public schools and then independent schools as well.
Representative Cole.
And when we say that it must be incorporated into the union-wide curriculum, does that mean that the schools have to include this type of education in their core courses, or could it be an elective course that students could or could not take, and that would count for the school?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that, and I think it would probably depend on how agriculture and nutrition education fits in under the education quality standards. If it's, a requirement that each student complete 6 hours by the time they graduate, then, it might be considered an elective 1 year, but you've got to take it to graduate. I think it would depend, and I think you could, I've seen, I have drafted and I've seen other bills drafted that say things like, I think the Holocaust education bill that Senate Education had a walkthrough of recently, trying to remember what room I was in when I did it, required 6 hours of instruction in Holocaust education studies. So that's kind of one way to get at it. But you can, the way this is written, because it's requiring the state board to include it in the education quality standards, I would say there's got to be some amount of requirement in there. What that is, I think, would depend on what the education quality standards are or how prescriptive you get.
Representative.
Following up on Representative Cole's question, I've heard a lot of bills, well, there's a cost to this or money piece, so it goes directly to appropriations or to Ways and Means. So if these were it's a new subject area, it requires professional development at a minimum or actual certification. And that means that teacher needs to take additional work over the summer, whenever, or online. I don't know how it's done. And that's going to, under a union contract, does that affect, is there a money component to this, what was considered a simple, common sense, very valuable addition given our culture and economy?
I think it's a great question, and I think the answer, again, I'm sorry, I'm not answering your questions today very concretely. I think it would depend on a couple things. One, I think it would depend on how prescriptive you all get. Agriculture and nutrition education is a relatively broad topic, right? It's possible, and so the point I'm going to make at the end of all of this is I think that's a question for the fields, really. But I think it would depend, their answer might depend on what you are asking them to do. So if education and nutrition, agriculture and nutrition education is a broad enough umbrella that they feel that there are already endorsements or courses being taught, et cetera, that are already doing this or would be a natural inclusion, it's possible that it's not a heavy lift and might not require any additional resources. If it would require a brand new endorsement to be created by the Professional Standards Board and a lot of professional development to get everyone on the same page, it's also possible that they would want to see some money that kind of help kickstart that process. So I think it depends on how prescriptive you all get in what you are requiring. But certainly the folks to answer that question would be the field. They're the ones who would know what they need.
Representative, yes, Representative Templeman.
So you've been kind of, answering these questions in a broad sense because the language is broad. And then, coupling that with this being interpretive by the specific school districts.
Supervisory unions are
Thank you.
responsible for the curriculum.
Okay, so, and then considering that we've been actually in agriculture class in this room, right? We've had a lot of people come and half of what we've been hearing, we walk away like, oh my God, like that's overwhelming. I don't even understand it. Right. So maybe it does behoove us to sort of like narrow down this. So, otherwise, what are we actually teaching or what will be taught? I'm just, for example, like if we wanted to talk about, this is what occurs to me. It may not be what everybody is thinking, but, I consider the environmental impacts of agriculture. So, if it were my bill, maybe I would have written like something like, the environmental impacts of agriculture being taught. But, maybe that's not what Henry had in mind. But maybe we can, specify a little more without stepping on the toes of the school unions.
That's a policy choice, right? So because school districts are municipalities that are at the, they're state created bodies, right? You can tell them what to do. My understanding of education in the state of Vermont is historically, and the way the law is written, is curriculum specific decisions are really a supervisory union responsibility. The state board sets standards that they have to work within and under. But you could absolutely deviate from that history and be more prescriptive than in the past.
Could we be more prescriptive by just being more specific with our language and then leaving it up to them to interpret?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yes, Representative O'Brien, then Representative Rice.
So following up on Representative Templeman's question, I'm just wondering, does the state board set things like how many hours must be spent? Because say like, would this be, one school could do a sort of survey, but let's take US history. So one school could do, 10,000 BC to present. Another could just do intensive study on the Civil War for the whole time, same amount of hours. And the same with agriculture. I can see like right now my sons are sugaring at the Sherman Academy because as an elective, because they have a sugar house, that's agriculture, right? So could they fulfill this requirement or do they need to actually learn, more sort of broad survey of how interconnected agriculture and nutrition are to our lives and the environment?
Excellent question. I'm pulling up the education quality standards now. I think what you are really getting at is curriculum. How is the subject matter taught? What are the methods of teaching? The philosophy is involved. And then the state board is setting those kind of minimum standards. So let's see. So, and I'll, let me share my screen again. And I will caveat all of this with, again, the education quality standards are they're open for rulemaking right now. So this could all change.
Great.
And that means the State Board of Education is looking at them and taking public comment and.
Yes, I'm not, I don't feel comfortable speaking to specifically where in the process they are, but the Act One working group was required to present recommendations to the state board for updating the education quality standards on diversity, equity, and inclusion, that very broad topic within how things are taught in school and what is taught in school. And the state board is charged with considering those. And so I know that they have a subcommittee, a working group that's looking at the education quality standards right now. So this is curriculum content. So this is the current State Board of Education rules, right? On what curriculum has to include. So each supervisory union board shall ensure the written and delivered curriculum within their supervisory union is aligned. Here, I'll make it bigger. Is that better? Aligned with the standards approved by the State Board of Education, and each school shall enable students to engage annually in rigorous, relevant, and comprehensive learning opportunities that allows them to demonstrate proficiency in, and then literacy. And then you can see there's a parenthetical there, expanding that concept, mathematical content and practices, again, expanding on that process, scientific inquiry and content knowledge. Depending on how prescriptive you get or what your goals are here, earth and space sciences, engineering design, depending on what is included in engineering, even under global citizenship, right? Concepts of civics, geography, cultural studies and history, physical and health education, and then artistic expression and transferable skills. So you can see here, each school shall provide students with at least 2 physical education classes per week. So that's pretty prescriptive. 30 minutes of physical activity. Let's see. Physical health education, including the effects of tobacco and there's also, so then there's the concept of personalized learning plans, which is kind of under the Flexible Pathways Initiative that was started 2014-ish, I believe. So there are, Vermont has expanded the ways in which students can meet these content subject matter areas. It doesn't necessarily have to just be taking a test and having lectures. There's dual enrollment program, there's career and technical education, and then each student is supposed to have a personalized learning plan that's geared towards them. There's also, to further muddy the waters for you all, there's also the concept of competency-based learning, which is, I am not the expert on this, and if you are interested in understanding really how things are being taught and how this works, I would really encourage you to hear from the field on this. But there are, I believe it's in here. I'm not going to Google it while we're talking, but I believe part of the education quality standards is that schools are using competency-based learning, which is going to vary a little from district to district or supervisory union to supervisory union. But it's possible that schools are not measuring student success or attainment of those standards in the old-fashioned A, B, C, D, F that we're all used to. And so how proficiency and competency is measured is also another kind of piece of the puzzle in how this information is delivered to students, and then how their competency is assessed.
Oh, this is complicated.
Lots of layers,
Yeah.
lots of layers.
Got somebody ahead of you. I think Mike had his end of it. Just want to mention while we have this in front of us, this is the education quality standards. It's not in statute. It's somewhere in the board.
Yes, and I will send a link to Alora. So this
For today, yeah.
the state board in statute is charged with developing education quality standards. They've done that through this rule. So this is a state board of education rule.
Okay, good. Chad.
Right. This is like everything we've touched since
Yes.
January. It is so fascinating. And Chairman Durfee has been a great leader in bringing testimony
Where did I find you, Beth?
It's shouting out to me that we need to have representatives from the Board of Education
So,
in
yeah.
here
Yeah.
to dialogue, and then we can, when I was a school board member, an old guy who's a retired engineer would say, Jed, I think kids would be interested in learning about the Great Circle route. He was a mathematician. Well, excuse me, Dr. Kilburn, what is the Great Circle route? He says, it's why when we take off from Boston, we want to go to Dublin, why we fly north toward the North Pole and back down to Dublin, as opposed to the common sense linear logic thing that you take a heading to Dublin as you lift off from Logan. And he says it's shorter and quicker by flying north, 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 east. And anyway, that's an example. I said, God, I'd love to learn. These kids would be fascinated by this. Getting Dr. Kilburn access to our school classroom was more difficult than climbing Everest barefoot. So, if we say we want Farmer McGregor to come into school and talk to kids, because we're trying to save their lives, get them on healthy food, connect with their communities and culture, or Farmer Pearl, or Farmer Supernaut to come in, that's really reaching a goal if we can reach all 200 towns. So anyway,
Want to be
the common
effective.
sense
Yeah.
approach versus the legal requirements, I think we need more input.
I think that you're right, and having the board come in, so when Beth talks about the field, superintendents, the classroom teachers to answer the questions about, do you already have the certification? Or do you
need
what else would you need to learn in order to be able to teach what we're thinking we'd like to have taught? Dave and then John.
I just wanted to ask if that last document could be posted for us somewhere, so
Put it
that
on our.
would be great. Thank you.
And I will also, if you'll indulge me, just share with you. And I'll send a link to this as well. This is the Agency of Education's website. And this is all of the content areas in which the state board has developed standards. And so, for example, I'll just take English language arts. So they have adopted the Common Core standards. And I'm not going to click on it. There's a hot link to the Common Core state standards. And those are the standards that when schools are developing curriculum, they need to be ensuring that they're teaching content that will allow their students to become proficient under the standards of the Common Core state standards. So within the Common Core state standards, or within, we're looking at math, they have adopted the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics Common Core state standards for mathematics. Within that, there's going to be that's where it's going to get more prescriptive of, algebra, calculus, geometry, et cetera. It's possible that somewhere in one of these content areas is some amount of nutrition or agriculture education. And so you might hear testimony that this is something that they can fit in. You might hear testimony that it's not already covered.
Yeah.
But we can, the bill, if you choose to take this up and really pursue it, can be a vehicle to achieve your goals in this area. And it certainly doesn't have to stay the way I drafted it. And you're going to want to make sure that whatever you put out there works.
I'm just going to ask one more question and then we'll take a break. If you want to pull it up again, you don't have to, Beth, but in section one, the A,
Oh, yep, I can pull up.
talks about the curriculum or the, I'll wait till you pull it up.
And I will say, I drafted this bill. I would say it's not common to require the agency to develop curriculum. That's really,
It's not common.
it's not common, but you could change the wording on that. You could require them to develop, a data bank of resources or, curriculum. My understanding is it's the way things are taught. It's the materials that are used, the philosophies that go into all of
So
that.
you don't need to pull it up, and that was really my question, whether the agency of education is in the practice of developing model curriculums, curricula for districts to use.
I would encourage you to hear from them on that, with the caveat of you can always require them to do
Anything we want, yeah.
whatever you want. But yes, but I would say that that's not the most common approach I've seen. But I also haven't seen, in my short tenure with the legislature, new content areas really taken up and fleshed out in the last couple years. So they might have different philosophy now, but you don't have to use the term. If you want the agency of education to work with other state agencies with the subject matter expertise to ensure that whatever is being taught in schools or meeting whatever your goals are, we can certainly play with the language on that. We don't have to use the term curriculum. And as long as you are clear on what your goals are, I can help you achieve that through writing the bill. But certainly the agency and the state board might have some suggestions for you on how to do that.
Good. Well, another question, John?
Yeah, just a couple quick ones. At what level do schools decide to go on a proficiency style or a, old GPA style?
So I believe under the education quality standards, and I'm going to do this while I'm not sharing my screen, the education quality standards require proficiency-based learning right now.
So every school is transitioning?
So, yes, so, yes, and I'm just I don't want to misquote this. Yes, so a student meets the requirements for graduation when the student demonstrates evidence of proficiency in the curriculum outlined in the rule that we looked at. And then the state boards can have other requirements for their graduation requirements. It gets even more local. So the goal for proficiency-based learning and proficiency-based graduation requirements. And again, this is really technical, and I am not the person to speak to you all on this, but I can flag it as something if you are interested in really understanding this, hearing from the field on this. But the goal was no later than September 2014 for students entering 7th grade, with the goal of the graduating class of 2020 being the first class to have had proficiency-based learning or proficiency-based graduation requirements. I have heard testimony this session that some supervisory unions and school districts are further along in that plan than others.
Okay. The other question was, how do the tech centers work with curriculums?
I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head. The tech centers are not, I will get back to you on that, and I will look at the statutes and rules around the tech centers, but generally speaking, they're providing kind of specialized education, so they're not preparing students for all of these subject matters, so it's different.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in.
Yes.
And this has been very, very helpful, I think, very informative. So we'll stop for now. We'll come back to this later and share our thoughts and figure out where we want to go next. Laura, I think you can end this meeting.